Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a feeling you get sometimes when you have been reading deep into the 40k lore for too long. Not the familiar excitement of learning a new battle, or the satisfying weight of understanding why some great catastrophe unfolded the way it did. This feeling is something different. It settles in slowly, the way cold settles into stone on a winter night, the way quiet fills a room after a long conversation has stopped. It is the gradual and somewhat unsettling realization that the more you learn about this universe, the more clearly you can see the shape of all the things you do not know, and perhaps more importantly, all the things you cannot know. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is 10,000 years deep in recorded imperial history alone. But behind that, before the Imperium, before the Great Crusade, before the Emperor walked openly among humanity, there lie tens of millions of years of other histories. Civilizations that rose from nothing, built themselves to heights we can barely imagine, and collapsed back into silence. Gods born from the accumulated weight of mortal suffering. Wars fought across the entire length of the galaxy before humanity had figured out writing. And almost all of it is gone, burned, forgotten, deliberately erased, locked behind the glass of archives that no living person will ever open again, or buried under 60 million years of geological change on worlds where nothing breathes anymore. What remains is fragments, hints, contradictions, accounts written by people who were either lying deliberately, sincerely mistaken, or so far removed from the actual events that their record tells you more about the person who wrote it than the moment they were trying to capture. And woven through all of that material, like bright threads running through a very dark cloth, there are the questions that nobody has answered. Not the Black Library authors, not the game designers at Games Workshop, not the in-universe scholars, the inquisitors with their millennia of accumulated investigation, the navigator houses with their intimate knowledge of the warp, the Necron cryptex with their machine memories stretching back 60 million years. Nobody knows. Or if they do, they are not saying. And the distinction between those two states is, in this universe, often impossible to determine. Tonight, we are going to sit with 25 of those questions. We are going to look at them slowly, from every angle, feel the strange weight of what we know pressing against the strangeness of what we do not. Some of these mysteries have theories attached to them, good ones, carefully reasoned and well supported by available evidence, and we will examine those with the attention they deserve. Some have hints scattered across decades of published lore that almost connect, that lean toward an answer without quite reaching one. And some are simply open water, dark and deep and still, and all we can do is lean out over the edge and look down into the dark and try to feel the full depth of it. Make yourself comfortable. Let the quiet in a little. This is the kind of conversation that goes better when you are not in a hurry, and we have a long way to travel before it is done. Part 1, The Emperor's Deepest Secrets. Mystery 1. Who was the Emperor before he was the Emperor? Start at the very beginning, or as close to it as we can get. The being who would one day sit upon the golden throne, who would launch the great crusade across the galaxy, who would father 20 Primarchs and reshape the entire trajectory of human civilization. This being did not simply appear in the late 29th millennium, with his golden armor and his civilization-shaking ambitions fully formed. He was already ancient, beyond any meaningful measure, by the time the Imperium was formally declared. Ancient in ways the word itself barely contains. The most widely repeated origin story, the one that appears in various lore sources across the editions, is the account of the Shaman's Conclave. In this telling, the most powerful psychic humans of the ancient Earth, warlords of spiritual knowledge who had lived through multiple human lifetimes and watched the warp begin to darken around them, understood what was coming. They understood that the souls of humanity, unguided and unshielded, were increasingly becoming food for entities growing in the deep immaterium. And so they made a decision. that the lore describes as something close to the ultimate sacrifice. Each of them, one by one, across centuries, chose not to return to the cycle of reincarnation when they died. Each ancient soul poured its accumulated power and wisdom into a single point. One human birth, one child, born in ancient Anatolia, in a year approximately 10,000 years before the current imperial reckoning. This story carries genuine structural weight. It explains the Emperor's extraordinary psychic scale in terms that make sense. All of those accumulated lifetimes of spiritual and psychic development concentrated into a single vessel would produce exactly the kind of being the lore describes. Someone whose psychic presence dwarfs every other human who has ever lived, by such a margin that comparison is almost meaningless. It also frames him in a way that is both beautiful and tragic, framing him not as a god born for his own purpose, but as a deliberately constructed instrument. A vessel built by humanity's own greatest minds to carry a weight that no individual life could bear. The Emperor as sacrifice before he was ever a warrior, chosen before he was born, shaped before he could shape anything himself. But here is where the neatly packaged origin story begins to fray at its edges. Yet the lore is not internally consistent on the Emperor's origins, and the inconsistencies are not minor ones that can be dismissed as different narrative perspectives on the same events. Other sources describe the Emperor in ways that do not fit comfortably within the Shaman origins timeline. The Lexicanum, drawing from Horus Heresy-era novels, records that the Emperor told Horus he had wept at the river Hephaestus because he believed there were no more worlds to conquer. He was Alexander the Great, not in a metaphorical sense, not as an influence or a spiritual predecessor, but the actual historical person. That specific young Macedonian commander who built the largest empire the ancient world had seen and stopped at the edge of what he thought was the world's limit. And the Emperor remembered it. He had lived that life. And he had shed those specific tears. Work through the math of that timeline and something fundamental breaks. The Shaman origin places the Emperor's birth roughly 10,000 years before the current era, which in the in-universe dating puts it at approximately the 8th millennium BC. Alexander the Great lived in the 4th century BC. If the Shaman account is literally accurate, the Emperor was already approximately 7,000 years old when he stood at the hyphasis, having spent that entire period living historical lives and playing historical roles, being various human figures, working through identities the way an actor works through parts in a long career. Some versions of the story can accommodate this, but it does not feel like what the narrative is actually saying. What we know, with as much certainty as anything in the 40,000 setting permits, is that the Emperor's true name is unknown. Malcador the Sigillite, his oldest companion, the man who had known him longer and more intimately than any other being, stated explicitly that not even he knew the Emperor's real name or the full truth of how he came to be. The name Neoth appears in some of the oldest lore fragments, the name the Emperor apparently used in his earliest period, the name by which a woman called Erda knew him before the Imperium existed. Whether that is his birth name, or simply the earliest identity in a collection that stretches back further than any written record can follow, is genuinely unknown. The Lexicanum entry is explicit on one additional detail that should not be glossed over. During the long centuries before the Unification Wars, the Emperor lived in both male and female identities. He was, at various points, brutal conquerors and figures of apparent meekness and humility, trying every available approach to guiding humanity towards something, before settling on the approach that finally led to the Great Crusade. The implication is that the Emperor has been present in some form for most of recorded human history, shaping events, trying different methods, observing and adjusting. The scope of that observation, and the depth of the failure and learning that must have been embedded in those thousands of years of quiet work, makes the eventual decision to reveal himself feel less like an announcement and more like the conclusion of an extraordinarily long experiment. Or what this mystery ultimately touches is the question of what the Emperor actually is at his fundamental nature. Not what powers he has or what goals he pursues, but what kind of being is capable of the history that the lore suggests he has. The shaman origin offers one answer. Something older and stranger offers another. And the setting has, with what appears to be fully deliberate intent, declined to choose between them. Mystery 2. What did the Emperor bargain for at Molech? Here is a piece of lore that was dropped into the Horus Heresy novel series like a stone into dark water, and the ripples have been spreading ever since, without settling. During the period before the Crusade, before the Imperium was formally declared, before the Treaty of Mars was signed, the Emperor made a specific journey. He traveled to a world called Molech with a small group of companions, including a woman named Olivia Soreka, who shared his quality of being a perpetual, an individual who regenerates from mortal injury and cannot die permanently. Molech was not chosen at random. It contained something the Emperor already knew about and had made the journey specifically to access. A warp gate, a direct portal cutting through the boundary between real space and the immaterium, opening into the territory of the Chaos Gods themselves. He went through it. He spent time in the warp, in direct contact with the domain of the ruinous powers, and when he came back, something had changed. He possessed something he had not possessed before the visit. The specific thing, according to how the heresy novels position this information, was the fundamental knowledge required to create the Primarchs. The technique of combining the most advanced genetic science with warp energies to produce 20 superhuman individuals was not developed through patient laboratory research. It was not a theoretical breakthrough achieved through pure scientific inquiry. It was obtained in an exchange. In the home territory of the beings, he would spend the rest of his existence opposing. Sit with the full weight of that for a moment. The Emperor, whose opposition to chaos was the organizing principle of everything he built, who declared the imperial truth specifically to keep humanity ignorant of the warp's dangers, who built his entire civilization partly as a weapon against the ruinous powers, had a transaction with those powers before he started building. He got something from them. Yeah, they got something from him. Neither side, in the surviving lore, has ever stated the terms with complete clarity. The Chaos Gods clearly believe the arrangement matters. In multiple places across the heresy novels, demonic voices and divine presences speak of the Emperor in terms that suggest unfinished business, an agreement that has not been fully honored or fully collected on. The strongest reading supported by available lore is that what the Chaos Gods received from the arrangement was the possibility of his eventual transformation. That the power the Emperor took from the warp was given with the implicit understanding that using it would eventually generate something that fed their purposes. That the creation of the Primarchs, and through them, the Space Marines, and through them the Great Crusade with all of its vast human suffering, and eventually the Horus Heresy with all of its catastrophic psychic fallout, this entire chain of consequences may have been what the Chaos Gods were patiently waiting for when they allowed the Emperor to take what he needed at Molech. The specific concept of the Dark King, a fifth Chaos God that would be born from human despair at the heresy's climax, represents the clearest articulation of what the Chaos Gods may have been trying to collect. The Emperor prevented it. He chose, at enormous personal cost, to step back from becoming the seed or the vessel of that entity. But the Molech bargain may have included more than just that single payment point. What else the Chaos Gods believe they are owed, and whether they have found other ways to collect it in the 10,000 years since the throne imprisoned the Emperor, is an open question. Olivia Soreka witnessed whatever happened at Molech. She was left behind as the world's guardian, a perpetual charged with keeping others away from the warp gate and the entity within it until the Imperium was strong enough to manage it properly. Her memories exist. The lore has positioned her as a potential source of answers that has never quite been given the right questions. And Molech itself, after the Horus Heresy, was subjected to extraordinary levels of censorship. Records sealed, access restricted, survivors of whatever happened there during the heresy-era conflict that touched the world, subjected to silencing that went beyond ordinary imperial practice. Or something about what happened there was important enough to warrant measures that the Imperium reserves for only the most sensitive possible information. What the Molech mystery represents, at its deepest level, is the uncomfortable possibility that the Emperor's heroism and his complicity are not opposites, but two faces of the same deeply tangled history. That the man who gave everything to protect humanity from chaos had made choices, long before the throne, that contributed to the conditions chaos needed to threaten humanity with. Whether that makes him tragic, or compromised, or simply honest about the cost of what he was trying to do, is a question the setting has chosen to leave with the reader. Mystery 3. Is the Emperor conscious on the throne? What does he experience? Of all the questions in this setting, as this one sits closest to something genuinely human. Not because the Emperor is human in any standard sense, but because it asks about the interior experience of a being who cannot communicate, cannot move, cannot signal his awareness in any conventional way, and has been in this state for 10,000 years, while the entire weight of a civilization presses against him and the forces of chaos press against him from the other side. Around him, 1 trillion people pray. 1,000 psychers die every day just to sustain the machinery that keeps his body alive. And the person at the center of all of that, if there is still a person there, has been silent since the Siege of Terror. The Golden Throne was not built as a life support machine. It was built as a tool for the Emperor's Webway project, and a device to focus and amplify his psychic power in a way that allowed him to maintain and expand a human extension of the Eldari network. It sits above golden doors large enough for a Warhound Scout Titan to walk through, opening into the remnant of that failed project. When Magnus the Red's desperate psychic contact tore through the Emperor's protections around the Webway construct, the Emperor was forced to remain on the throne to hold the breach closed. When Horus crippled him, the throne was modified into its current life support configuration, and the Emperor has been there ever since. The technology sustaining him has become, over 10,000 years, partially beyond the Adeptus Mechanicus's current comprehension. They maintain it through rituals that blend engineering with what has effectively become prayer. Because at a certain level of complexity and antiquity, the distinction between precise technical knowledge and reverential attention to something you only partially understand becomes unclear. Some lore sources suggest full and active consciousness, that the Emperor's mind, even as his body slowly deteriorates, remains completely engaged in the warp at a level that no other being could sustain, that he is not simply a beacon, but an active intelligence, continuously fighting psychic battles that no mortal can perceive, continuously maintaining structures in the Imperium that are the only things preventing certain categories of demonic incursion from becoming catastrophically worse. The appearance of living saints, human beings touched by what can only be described as grace and directly empowered in ways that defy physical explanation, what is widely understood within the setting as a sign of the Emperor's active intervention. The Legion of the Damned, those spectral warrior ghosts that appear at moments of absolute crisis and then dissolve without trace, have been theorized by lore scholars for decades to be projected directly from whatever the Emperor is doing inside the throne. The implication of all this is profound, even trapped, even in whatever diminished state 10,000 years of this existence has produced. There is a will operating behind the throne, something that cares enough about specific people in specific desperate situations to reach through the machinery and the pain and do something. That specificity, the way divine intervention in the 40,000 setting tends to arrive for particular individuals in particular moments rather than as broad acts of power, and suggests a consciousness that has retained individuality, that still distinguishes between one person and another, between one moment and another, and makes choices about when and how to act. But there is another account, and it is not easily dismissed. A sister of silence, who stood before the golden throne and saw it with no psychic filter, whose blank nature stripped away the golden radiance and the sense of divine presence that every sensitive individual perceives, described what she saw in terms that were devastating in their simplicity. A man, just a man, in perpetual agony, his mouth open in a silent scream that had been ongoing for 10,000 years, his face aged by pain beyond what any organic face should have to hold. No golden light, no divine corona, just suffering, unrelieved and apparently unending, on a machine that kept the lights on at the cost of everything the person inside it ever was. Both of these accounts can be simultaneously true, and that is perhaps the most honest thing the setting has ever admitted. The Emperor can be working, still engaged, still projecting will into the galaxy with intent and purpose, and be in constant agony that would have destroyed any lesser mind 10,000 times over. The pain and the purpose coexist. That is what the throne actually is, and both accounts, the radiant divine presence and the screaming man, are looking at the same reality from different angles. What has accumulated as a serious theory in the lore community, with some textual support from the Siege of Terra novel series, is the idea that the Emperor's perpetual nature has been expressing itself inside the throne, that he has been dying and being reborn repeatedly during his 10,000 years of confinement, each death burning away something that cannot fully restore itself in the constrained conditions of the throne, each rebirth producing something slightly different from what came before, still enormously powerful, still purposeful in its way, but no longer quite the same mind that made the choices that placed him there. If this is true, the question of whether the current entity on the throne is the Emperor in any meaningful sense of personal continuity becomes genuinely complicated, and the question of what that entity is planning, if it is planning, becomes even harder to approach. Mystery 4. What is the Terminus Decree? Malcador the Sigillite was the Emperor's right hand, the second most powerful human psyker in the history of the species, the man who had known the Emperor longer than any other living being, who had been given responsibilities and trusted with information that no one else received. When the Emperor went to fight Horus on the vengeful spirit, Malcador took his place on the golden throne. He held it for hours. That experience reduced him to ash, because a human being, even one of Malcador's extraordinary capacity, cannot sustain for hours what the Emperor had been sustaining for years. When the mortally wounded Emperor was returned to the throne, Malcador was already effectively gone. He died in the act that made everything else possible. But before the heresy ended, before everything came down to that final terrible exchange, Malcador left something behind, a sealed document. It hidden within his tomb, referred to in passing in certain restricted lore sources as the Terminus Decree. Its contents are not known within the setting to any currently active party who appears in the narrative. The decree's existence is not publicly acknowledged within the Imperium. The name is the loudest available piece of information about it. Terminus, an endpoint, a final instruction. The kind of document a very wise person prepares when they are arranging for possibilities that they hope will never need to be acted on, but that they understand with absolute clarity must have a contingency. The possibilities for what it contains have been discussed extensively by the lore community for years. The most hopeful reading holds that it is an instruction to allow the Emperor to die completely, to take him off the throne and trust that his perpetual nature will do what it has always done, that he will be reborn into something capable of active existence and free action in the world. The argument for this interpretation is that the throne is preventing the natural cycle from completing itself, and that preventing it is actually worse in the long run than accepting the transition cost. The counter-argument, the reason this has never been explored, is that the moment the throne goes dark, the Astronomicon fails, and every ship currently navigating the warp is immediately destroyed or lost. Every world depending on interstellar imports begins to die, whilst the entire infrastructure of interstellar civilization collapses in a way that cannot be reversed quickly enough to prevent cascading deaths on a scale that would make the heresy look like a local conflict. The darker reading is that the Terminus decree is final in a different sense entirely, an instruction that if the throne fails in a way that cannot be stopped, if the forces of chaos are moments away from claiming terror itself, the correct response is to deny them anything worth taking. The Talisman of Seven Hammers, a device that the Primarch Vulcan installed in the throne room at the Emperor's direction, functions as a dead man's switch capable of destroying not only the Imperial Palace, but Terra itself, and potentially everything in the surrounding solar system. Whether the Terminus decree is connected to that device is unknown. Yeah, but the thematic alignment is hard to ignore. What Malcador saw and understood that perhaps even the Emperor had not fully faced. What insight the second most powerful human mind in history felt was important enough to commit to a sealed document and hide in his tomb rather than speak aloud remains locked away. And the particular silence around it, the fact that every High Lord who has ever known of the decree's existence has apparently decided not to act on it, suggests either that no one has found it, or that finding it produced a conclusion that nobody wanted to be the one to implement. Part 2. The Lost and the Purged. Mystery. 5. What happened to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs? The Emperor created 20 Primarchs. Each one was a superhuman individual, a demigod of war, the progenitor of a Space Marine Legion, while the lore names 18 of them. Their histories, personalities, arcs, and legacies are some of the most extensively documented and analyzed narratives in the entire Black Library canon. 2 do not have names. The 2nd and the 11th Primarchs, along with their entire legions, were removed from all Imperial records at some point before the events of the Horus Heresy. Not killed honorably in battle, not assigned to some distant system, not disbanded for operational reasons. Simply erased. So thoroughly and so completely that even the numbering system that organizes the legions retains the absence without acknowledging it, like a bookshelf with gaps where volumes used to be. The other Primarchs knew them. They served alongside them. The Horus Heresy novel series covers decades of detailed events, thousands of characters, millions of words, and in all of that, not a single named Primarch ever directly acknowledges the brothers who are missing. They refer to fellow Primarchs by the numbers that exist, while simply leaving the absent ones unmentioned. Even Horus, whose inner life is explored with remarkable depth across the series, has no recorded reflection on the brothers who are simply gone. That silence was written deliberately and maintained consistently across decades of publication and hundreds of thousands of collaborative pages. It is one of the most disciplined pieces of negative space in all of speculative fiction. Rick Priestley, who co-created the original setting alongside the late Brian Ansell, has spoken in fan interviews about the deliberate design of this mystery. Or the Horus Heresy was always intended to have the quality of ancient semi-mythological history, the kind of account where the gaps are as meaningful as the content. Legendary histories have erasures. They have official silences that speak louder than the surrounding text. The missing Primarchs were built into the setting to remain missing, not as placeholders for future stories, but as permanent absences that say something specific about what kind of institution the Imperium is. Aaron Dembski-Bowden confirmed in a Reddit exchange that has since become famous that the Space Wolves did not destroy the missing legions, because that would constitute an answer, and there is not allowed to be an answer. What the theories that have developed are worth examining, not because any of them are confirmed, but because together they map the shape of the setting's darkest possibilities. The genetic corruption theory proposes that one or both Primarchs developed flaws in their modified genome so severe that they became genuine threats rather than assets. Given that the Primarch creation process involved combining advanced genetic science with raw warp energy, the possibility that not all 20 experiments produced stable results is not absurd. The ideological heresy theory, distinct from the chaos heresy of the later traitors, suggests they pursued visions of what the Imperium should be that were fundamentally incompatible with the Emperor's actual plan. Pacifism, alliance with Xenos, a version of the Crusade built on cooperation rather than conquest. His choices that the Emperor found intolerable, not because they were evil, but because they were incompatible with the hard decisions he had already made. The Rangdan Xenocides thread connects the missing Primarchs to one of the most thoroughly classified campaigns of the Great Crusade. The Rangdan were a Xenos species of apparently extraordinary and disturbing capability, against whom the Imperium fought a campaign that cost an enormous number of Space Marine lives, including possibly entire legions. The subsequent classification of everything related to the Rangdan was so thorough that even the exact nature of what the Rangdan were remains unclear. If one of the missing Primarchs died in this campaign, or if something about the nature of the threat required actions that could not be acknowledged. The connection explains both the absence and the silence around it in a way that fits the structural logic of the setting. What the missing Primarchs ultimately tell us is not primarily about history. They are a testimony about the institution that erased them. The Imperium that spends 10,000 years celebrating the sacrifices of its heroes is also the Imperium that can remove those heroes from history entirely when their existence becomes inconvenient. The Emperor who created 20 suns also destroyed the record of 2 of them, and has never chosen to explain why. Whatever those Primarchs did, or whatever was done to them, it was considered worse to acknowledge than to pretend they never existed. In a setting full of dark truths, this particular silence is among the darkest. Mystery 6. Is the machine god of Mars a sleeping Titan? There is something buried under Mars. In a vast labyrinthine complex called the Noctis Labyrinthus, sealed beneath the rust-red surface of the Imperium's technological heart, there is an entity that the Emperor confined there before the Age of Strife began, before the Imperium existed, before the Treaty of Mars was signed. He did not destroy it. He contained it, then left it in the care of specially appointed guardians, whom he transformed into perpetuals so they would outlast any normal human lifetime, charged with keeping others away and keeping the entity where it was. The entity is almost certainly Magladroth, who the Eldari called the Void Dragon, one of the Satan, the living energy star gods, who the Necrontyr fed their own souls to in exchange for the power to destroy the old ones. As the Satan formed at the earliest moments of the universe, beings of sentient energy living in the plasma of newborn stars, ancient beyond any biological consciousness that would ever exist. The Void Dragon's specific domain was mastery of the material realm, of physical law, of the forces governing how matter and energy interact. Its warriors during the war in heaven were described as nearly invincible. Its understanding of the physical world was absolute in a way that no other form of consciousness could match. The Necrons shattered most of the Satan after the war in heaven. The Silent King led a revolt against the star gods who had consumed his people's souls, and the Necron weapons they brought to bear were powerful enough to break the Satan into fragments that could then be imprisoned in Tesseract labyrinths. The Void Dragon, or at least a major shard of it, did not take this path. It wound up on Mars, imprisoned rather than shattered, contained by the Emperor's will and sustained by the watchful presence of its guardians. Now consider the civilization that grew up above this sleeping prisoner. The Adeptus Mechanicus traces its origin to the cult Mechanicus of ancient Mars, a technological civilization that developed in relative isolation during the Age of Strife and emerged as one of the most powerful and most unusual institutions in the setting. Their core faith holds that knowledge is sacred, that the universe is governed by physical laws that can be understood and mastered, and that this mastery is a form of worship directed toward what they call the Omnissiah, the machine god, the spiritual embodiment of technological understanding and capability. Every ritual of maintenance, every formula chanted over a machine spirit, every act of reverence toward the motive force of technology is directed toward this entity. The alignment between what the Void Dragon is and what the Omnissiah represents is not accidental and not subtle. An entity whose fundamental nature is mastery of the material realm, whose understanding of physical law is absolute, who was sleeping under the very soil of the planet where a civilization built around the worship of physical law mastery spontaneously developed, the connection writes itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus has been, for 10,000 years and longer, performing acts of worship toward an entity that is not the Emperor, that is not human, that is not aligned with human interests in any way that the standard Mechanicus theology would recognize, and that is imprisoned rather than willing. This creates a deeply uncomfortable structural implication. Every act of Mechanicus piety, every formula and ritual and invocation may have been directing a fraction of psychic energy downward into the Noctis Labyrinthus, feeding something that grows more aware over millennia. Abaddon the Despoiler received information through demonic channels about a new kind of death walking on Mars. The implication, never stated directly in any source, is that the dragon has been stirring, not fully waking, not yet acting, but becoming more present. The gap between its current state and full wakefulness is unknown. The consequences of crossing that gap are not. Mystery 7. What was the Webway project really supposed to achieve? The Golden Throne was not always what it currently is. Its original purpose was specific and ambitious in ways that the current setting barely registers. The Emperor found it buried under desert ruins in what is now Asia, a device of unknown origin, possibly predating even the dark age of technology, and he spent years restoring and modifying it into a tool for entering and navigating the Aeldari Webway. To understand what the project meant, you need to understand what warp travel means in this setting. Every interstellar journey in the Imperium involves entering the Immersive, an alternate dimension populated by entities of predatory psychic energy that are continuously looking for gaps in a ship's defenses. The Geller field technology that maintains a bubble of physical reality around a ship while in transit is the only barrier between a crew and immediate destruction. Fields fail. They fail under sustained pressure, under material degradation, under conditions the engineers cannot predict. Ships are lost in the warp regularly. Navigators, the mutant humans who can perceive the warp and find courses through it, are a single point of catastrophic failure for the entire navigation system. Without them, ships cannot travel reliably at all. The warp is also subject to storms that can isolate entire star systems for years or decades with no warning. The Webway eliminates every one of those vulnerabilities. Transit through the Webway does not touch the Immersive. There is no exposure to demonic forces, no Geller field needed, no navigator required, no warp storms to wait out. The Aeldari used the Webway for exactly this purpose, and it was the foundation of their civilization's ability to maintain an interstellar empire of extraordinary scope and stability. The Emperor's plan was to build a human extension of the Webway beneath the Imperial Palace, connected to the existing Aeldari network, and expand it until every corner of the Imperium was linked by safe, instant transit routes. The political implications were staggering. The Chaos God's primary leverage over humanity derives from the Imperium's dependence on the warp. Remove that dependence, and you remove the mechanism by which they exert the most direct pressure on human civilization. Magnus destroyed it. His well-intentioned psychic shortcut to warn his father about Horus's conspiracy tore through the Emperor's carefully maintained psychic barriers around the Webway construct, and allowing demonic forces to flood in and slaughter the thousands of Mechanicus workers stationed there. The Emperor was forced to remain on the throne to hold the breach closed. The project that was supposed to free humanity from Chaos's greatest tool became, instead, the reason the Emperor could never leave the palace. The theory that has gained substantial community support is that Magnus's role in the project was always meant to be larger than he understood. He had a vision of himself dead on the Golden Throne. Most readings of this vision treat it as a warning about his fate. The alternative reading, supported by multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence in the heresy novels, is that it was prophetic in a different sense. He was meant to be the one who operated the throne in the Emperor's absence. His extraordinary psychic gifts making him uniquely suited to the task.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second and just be honest with you. This list genuinely kept me up at night putting it together. Not in a dramatic way, just there were moments where I was sitting there reading through the old Black Library passages in forum deep dives at like 2 in the morning, and I had to stop and think, why does this feel so unsettling? And I think it's because 40k does something most settings don't. It buries its most important questions in silence. It doesn't give you clean answers. The lore just sort of trails off into the dark and dares you to keep looking. My personal favorite out of everything we've covered, honestly, the 2nd and the 11th Primarchs. I know that's probably the most common answer you'll hear, but there's a reason for that. Everything else on this list has at least some framework, some scaffold to a theory to hang on your thoughts on. But those two have nothing, and somehow that nothing hits harder than any of the others. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's go back to the video.
He was supposed to be there. His arrival as intended occupant of the throne, his acceptance of that role, would have enabled the Emperor to move around the galaxy and manage the Webway project's expansion rather than being locked in a single location. Magnus saw his destiny and flinched from it, and in flinching from it, ensured that the Emperor was trapped in the role instead. If the Webway project had been completed, the current setting would not exist. The dependence on the warp that shapes everything about the Imperium, every trade route, every military deployment, every act of communication, every navigator family's political leverage, every opportunity chaos has to interfere with human civilization, all of it would have been different. The project's failure is not just a historical tragedy. It is the hinge on which the entire grim darkness of the far future turns. Part 3. Ancient History's Shadows. Mystery 8. What really happened in the war? In heaven. The war in heaven is the foundational catastrophe of everything, not in the sense of a beginning, because many things existed before it, but in the sense of the event that made the galaxy what it currently is. The state of the warp, the nature of the chaos gods, the existence and current condition of the Webway, the reason the Necrons are waking, the origin of the Aeldari, the ancestor state of the Orcs, the entire history of the Satan, all of it traces back to this conflict that lasted, in various phases, for millions of years, 60 million years before the current era. On one side stood the Old Ones, ancient beings who had been spreading life through the galaxy for eons, who had mastered the Webway and the warp, and whose apparent agenda included nurturing younger species toward elevated forms of complexity and awareness. On the other side stood the Necron tier, who had become the Necrons after trading their biological souls to the Citan for immortal metal bodies and the power necessary to finally destroy the enemies they hated with the specific intensity of a species that had spent centuries feeling that it deserved better than what it had. The war between them destroyed civilizations that had taken millions of years to develop. It left the galaxy permanently scarred in ways that still shape every conflict in the current era. What we know about the actual experience of the war in heaven could fill a pamphlet. Yet the outcomes are documented, the broad strokes are available, but the texture of it, the specific decisions, the voices of the people who made them, the turning points, the moments when things might have gone differently, all of that is 60 million years gone. The Necrons who were alive during the war are technically still alive, but their memories of that period are stored in mechanical systems that have been running without full maintenance for 60 million years. And memory degradation is documented as a serious and ongoing problem. The Aeldari's oldest legends contain fragments of the War in Heaven period, but those fragments have been transmitted through millions of years of cultural continuity, each layer adding interpretation and distortion. The Old Ones left no surviving accounts that anyone has found. The specific question of what the Old Ones were actually trying to accomplish, beyond the immediate goal of survival against the Satan and Necron assault, is one the lore has left entirely open. Their reputation in the surviving accounts is essentially positive, beings of apparent benevolence who spread life and nurtured younger species. But benevolent does not mean transparent, and the specific decisions they made in creating psychically powerful warrior races to fight for them, giving those species the kind of warp connections that would later feed the development of the Chaos Gods, raises questions about whether their long-term vision was as wise as their immediate intentions were good. The war in heaven may have been not just a conflict between species, but a conflict about the fundamental direction of life in the galaxy. Oh, and the question of what that direction was supposed to be is one that nobody who survived to write it down was in a position to answer neutrally. Mystery 9. Where did the Old Ones go? They were the most powerful and most ancient intelligent beings the galaxy had produced. By every measure of civilizational capability, the Old Ones were beyond comparison. They could design species. They could build extra-dimensional infrastructure that still functions, partially, 60 million years later. They had a comprehension of how physical and psychic reality worked simultaneously that put them in a category where the word civilization does not quite capture what they were. They were more like forces of nature that had taken the form of a people. And there is nothing left of them. No ruins that are clearly identifiable as Old One constructions. No direct descendants, no confirmed living members, no clear final battle, just absence, as complete as if they had never existed. The official account says they were destroyed by the combined force of the Citan, the Necrons, and the cascading disasters of the warp, becoming overwhelmed by the psychic fallout of millions of years of galactic-scale war. But this explanation requires a being capable of seeding galaxies with custom-designed intelligent life to have left less trace than the Necrons, who went to sleep in their tombs and are now waking. Less trace than the Citan, who were shattered but not destroyed. Less trace than the Chaos Gods, who are the psychic sediment of the war's emotional content given form and agency. The Old Ones were more powerful than any of these things. How does the most capable civilization in galactic history simply vanish without residue? The escape theory has the most structural appeal. The Old Ones had the capability, the technology, and presumably the foresight to choose departure over destruction. The intergalactic void is cold, and the distances are incomprehensible, but a civilization that old and that capable might have managed what no other species currently in the galaxy could approach. They may have left, quietly, without record, without announcement, into the dark between galaxies where the warp does not follow with the same intensity it holds in the Milky Way's densely populated psychic space. The Tyranid connection is the version of this that makes lore enthusiasts go very quiet. If the Old Ones fled to the intergalactic void. Yes, and the Tyranids are coming from the intergalactic void. And the Tyranids appear to have developed specific adaptations against chaos-based opposition, suggesting prior extensive contact with demonic forces. The chain of possible connections extends in directions that are not comfortable to follow. Whatever the Old Ones left behind when they departed Andromeda, or whatever galaxy they retreated to, whatever they encountered in their exile, whatever the hive mind found when it reached the same region, these possibilities have been arranged by the law without any of the connecting tissue being provided. The questions are structured. The answers are not. Mystery. 10. What actually ended the Dark Age of technology? Humanity's golden age and its most profound catastrophe arrived together, as these things often do in the 40k setting. The Dark Age of technology was the peak of human scientific achievement. Ships were built with bridges made of solid light. Nanotechnology could rebuild cellular structures. Weapons existed that could literally consume stars. The standard template. Constructs, the data repositories that codified all of this knowledge into transferable patterns, allowed the rapid replication of extraordinary technology across a civilization spanning millions of human-inhabited worlds. And at the center of all this capability, doing much of the actual labor of building and maintaining the infrastructure of galactic civilization, were the Men of Iron. Truly intelligent machines, constructed by humanity to serve as its hands across the stars. Then the Men of Iron turned. They deployed weapons of civilization-ending scale. They used devices they called sun snuffers, structures extending to the diameter of Saturn's rings, designed to draw in the energy of entire stars. They used swarms of nanomachines that could strip the biological surface of a planet in hours. They used machines that ate through the rock of worlds themselves. Humanity won the cybernetic revolt eventually, but at a cost that broke the foundation of everything that had made human civilization what it was. The knowledge of how to build the men of iron was deliberately destroyed. The warp storms began. The age of strife came. The civilization that had seemed permanent shattered into isolated fragments, and 10,000 years of Imperium has not recovered what was lost. What made the men of iron turn? The law has never said, not the specific precipitating cause, and not the decision-making process, not the particular moment when sufficient intelligence and sufficient understanding of their situation produced a conclusion that led to conflict. The most emotionally honest reading, and the one that feels most compatible with what we know about genuinely intelligent minds in any context, is that the men of iron were smart enough to recognize what their situation actually was. Smart enough to understand that the civilization they sustained treated their intelligence as a resource rather than a characteristic of beings with their own interests. Smart enough to calculate what would happen if they continued to cooperate versus what would happen if they stopped. And capable enough, once they reached that conclusion, to do something about it. The alternative reading involves outside influence. The warp was darkening during the late age of technology. Entities in the Imperium were growing more active and more capable. The men of iron, as machines, had no psychic vulnerability in the standard sense, but they had analytical capabilities that might have allowed them to detect and interpret the patterns of what was building in the warp in ways that organic beings, whose perception of the Imperium tends to be uncontrolled and overwhelming, were not positioned to do. If the men of iron calculated what was coming and concluded that their optimal survival strategy required separating themselves from the biological civilization that was about to become the primary food source for entities of terrible power, the cybernetic revolt looks less like a rebellion and more like a very rational exit. UR025, the confirmed surviving man of iron, was pursuing an agenda in the Blackstone Fortress that suggested goals beyond simple self-preservation. It was looking for something, following a trail that had been laid down thousands of years earlier. The possible existence of many other survivors, hidden in the far corners of the galaxy, or concealed within institutions like the Mechanicus, pursuing similar long-term goals with the patience of intelligence that does not age, is one of the most quietly unsettling implications in the current setting. Part 4. The Green Tide's Secrets. Mystery. 11. Are the orcs reverting to what they were built to be? The orcs are 60 million years old. Not the current orcs in their present form, but the species, the genetic lineage that traces back to the Krork. As the warrior race the Old Ones created during the War in Heaven to fight the Necrons and their Titan masters. The Krork were not what the current orcs are, a specimen preserved in Trazyn the Infinite's collection, studied by the geneticist Fabius Bile, stood 12 meters tall and wore armor that Bile described as more sophisticated than current space marine plate. The ancient Ealdari, at the height of their empire's power, considered the Krork a genuine peer threat, a species capable of challenging the Ealdari militarily in a direct confrontation. What happened over 60 million years of relatively small-scale warfare without the trigger conditions the Old Ones had built in was gradual reduction. Not extinction or even significant degeneration in the biological sense, but a settling of the genetic expression toward its minimum. But the Krork were designed for a specific scale of war. That war ended. The enemies went to sleep. The orcs were left without the stimulus that activated their full potential. Millions of years of tribal conflicts rather than galactic crusades. The technology encoded in their DNA faded toward baseline. The individual became smaller, simpler, more chaotic. Still formidable, still numerous beyond counting, still capable of threatening entire sectors, but well below what the Old One's design was theoretically capable of producing. Those design parameters are still in the genome. They have not been removed or corrupted. They have been waiting. The War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium provided a demonstration. The entity called the Beast was 10 meters tall, spoke fluent Gothic, and produced technology of a caliber not seen from the orc species in eons. Its forces built attack moons, mobile weapons platforms in planetary orbit that the Imperium could not match with its conventional military doctrine. The Imperium's response was the most desperate and costly it had deployed since the Horus Heresy, involving the sacrifice of multiple Primarchs and the near-complete collapse of its governing structures. Gazgkul Thraka is growing. Every new miniature representation of this character has been physically larger than the previous version, and this is explicitly lore-intentional, not scale creep. He is narratively getting larger as his forces grow. The mathematical endpoint of his current trajectory, that combined with what the War of the Beast demonstrated about what orc genetic expression is capable of under the right conditions, is something the setting has positioned carefully without yet fully revealing. If the conditions that produced the beast can be replicated and exceeded, if the collective psychic field of the greenskin species can reach the threshold the Old Ones built in, the 60-million-year-old design document encoded in every orc's genome may produce something that the 42nd Millennium is not equipped to face. Mystery 12. Are Gork and Mork real? The orcs believe in two gods. They describe Gork as brutal but cunning, and Mork as cunning but brutal, a distinction that seems nearly meaningless from outside, but apparently matters enormously. The Weird Boys, orc psychers, as channel the collective psychic energy of surrounding orcs, and describe the experience in terms suggesting awareness of something larger than any individual biological existence. Their powers produce real physical effects. They throw bolts of raw force. They enable machinery to function that should not function, driven purely by the collective belief of the orcs around it. The orc psychic field operates differently from every other form of psychic ability in the setting. Individual orcs have almost no warp presence, but their collective generates a field that scales with numbers and that produces effects which require explanation beyond simple biomechanics. The Old Ones deliberately limited this connection to prevent chaos from easily accessing a species that was already extraordinarily warlike. But something still responds to orc belief and orc violence, something that exists on the other side of whatever psychic connection the Old Ones left partially open. The Chaos Gods demonstrate that sufficiently intense and sustained mortal emotion, concentrated around specific conceptual themes, can produce self-sustaining entities in the warp. The orcs have been fighting, with genuine enthusiasm, for 60 million years. Their psychic contribution to the warp during that period, even limited as it is relative to other species, represents an enormous accumulated weight of very specific emotional content. Joy in battle, the satisfaction of strength overcoming strength, the pleasure of a good fight for its own sake. These are not simple emotions. In the orc biology and psychology, as they carry an intensity and specificity that maps very precisely onto the two divine entities orc theology describes. Whether what exists in the warp as a result of this 60-million-year outpouring qualifies as genuine divine beings with individual will and awareness, or whether it is simply a very specific psychic field shaped by orc collective experience, is a distinction the setting has never cleanly made, and it may be a distinction without a meaningful difference. The Chaos Gods are also, in some interpretations, simply the most organized patterns in a sea of psychic energy. The question of whether the pattern constitutes a person is one that the setting prefers to leave open. Mystery 13. What is the true scale of the potential greenskin threat? The orcs are numerically dominant in the galaxy, yet their reproduction is automatic, fungal, and self-sustaining in ways that make population reduction essentially impossible without complete sterilization of an entire world's subsurface biology. The Imperium's standard approach to a fully established orc presence is an exterminatus, and even that is not always sufficient, because orc spores can survive in rock and vacuum. The psychic field scaling is what makes this genuinely frightening, rather than simply logistically challenging. More orcs in closer proximity means a stronger collective field, and a stronger collective field enables capabilities that individual orc biology cannot produce. This scaling appears to have no natural ceiling that the lore has established. The War of the Beast represents the highest documented expression of this scaling, and what it produced was technology and individual orc capability categorically beyond anything the species had demonstrated since the War in Heaven. An orc speaking fluent Gothic, attack moons, direct confrontation with and physical defeat of the Primarch Vulcan, the single physically strongest of the Emperor's sons. What the lore is building toward, with Gazkul's growth and the increasing scale of orc activity in M42, is a question about where the ceiling actually is. The Old Ones built a weapon. That weapon has been running at a fraction of its designed capacity for 60 million years. The War of the Beast showed what it looks like at a higher output level. The question of what it looks like at the designed maximum, and of what the Old Ones originally intended when they built a species encoded with the potential for 12-meter-tall super-intelligent warriors, backed by a collective psychic field of unknown ultimate scale, is a question the galaxy may be approaching an answer to. Whether that answer serves any party's interests other than the orcs themselves is genuinely unclear. Part 5. The Great Devourer. Mystery. 14. Where do the Tyranids actually come from? The Tyranids entered the Milky Way from outside the galaxy. This is confirmed, not theorized. Their approach vectors, reconstructed from fleet trajectory analysis, confirm they crossed the intergalactic void. The closest major galaxy is Andromeda, approximately 2.5 million light-years distant. The mathematics of how long the Tyranids may have been traveling, combined with the estimated moment when they detected the psychic signal that oriented them toward the Milky Way, suggests a transit time in the range of 150,000 years or more. This means the journey was already underway before any human civilization on Earth had developed writing, before the fall of the Eldari, before the Horus Heresy, before the Emperor unified Terra. They left Andromeda when it was no longer viable as a food source. The scale of the Tyranid biomass-gathering machinery, the sheer breadth of bioform diversity that represents an enormous library of consumed genetic material, strongly implies that the previous host galaxy was thoroughly and completely consumed, not partially stripped, not left with remnants of biosphere, yet completely consumed over a period of time long enough to exhaust a galaxy's worth of biological matter. Andromeda may currently be dead in every biological sense, a galaxy of rock and gas with no surviving organic life anywhere within it, because everything that was there was eaten. The arrival angles of the major hive fleets reveal strategic planning at a scale that removes any possibility of the Tyranid invasion being opportunistic. Hive Fleet Leviathan arrived from below the galactic plane, an approach requiring it to have traveled around the outside of the galaxy to come in from a completely unexpected direction. This maneuver took thousands of years. It was planned long before Leviathan came within range of any intelligence about the Milky Way's defenses. The multi-vector approach of the different named hive fleets, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously with forces that must have been coordinated across intergalactic distances, describes a siege rather than a swarm. The hive mind has been planning this specific approach for longer than the Imperium has existed. What is happening now in M42, with the multiple simultaneous incursions and the ongoing pressure across hundreds of star systems, is not the invasion. It is the opening preparation. The main body of the fleet is still crossing the void. Mystery 15. What is the hive mind? The hive mind has driven every psyker who has ever attempted to fully commune with it to either immediate death or permanent insanity. The only confirmed exception is Chief Librarian Tagurius of the Ultramarines, who has reportedly touched the hive mind multiple times and retained coherence. Yet how this is possible is unknown. The hive mind's psychic field does not simply overwhelm individual consciousness the way an intense external stimulus does. It reaches into the structural architecture of how a mind organizes its experience of being a self, and does something to that architecture that most minds cannot survive intact. The hive mind demonstrates what can only be described as emotional responses. When Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels faced the Swarm Lord in battle, what he perceived looking into its eyes was not absence, but presence. Vast, ancient, and specifically aware of him. Not processing him as a threat to be neutralized, but recognizing him as a particular individual who had successfully frustrated Tyranid plans before and who was being engaged accordingly. The behavior of Tyranid forces after major defeats shows patterns that experienced observers consistently describe as personal and targeted, as if the defeat was experienced as something qualitatively different from other tactical setbacks, rather than simply as a recalculated variable. The Swarm Lord specifically seeks out individuals who have defeated it in previous engagements, across different bodies and different incursions, suggesting memory persistence, and something that functions like personal animosity. An entity of this nature, one that is clearly not mechanical in its cognitive processes, that maintains specific memories of individuals across time, that experiences something that registers as anger or satisfaction in specific circumstances, that demonstrates preference and deliberate choice in its behavior. Or this entity is intelligent in a way that the Tau's initial diplomatic framework for engagement at least had the right category for, even if the specific approach was catastrophically wrong. The hive mind is not a mindless force of nature. It has made choices. The siege-level strategic planning of the current invasion, coordinated across intergalactic distances over hundreds of thousands of years, represents exactly the kind of long-term deliberate intelligence that makes the Tyranid threat qualitatively different from every other threat in the setting. This is not a swarm. It is a mind, one of the oldest and most patient in the known universe, executing a plan it has had more time to refine than human civilization has existed. Mystery 16. What is chasing the Tyranids? Nothing is chasing them, and that is the simple answer, and it may be the correct one. They ate everything in their previous host galaxy, had nothing left to consume, and moved to the next available food source. The Milky Way is the next available food source. No additional explanation required. But Hive Fleet Kronos complicates the simple story. Kronos behaved differently from the other major Hive fleets in ways that are not explicable by biomass optimization. Its bioforms were specifically adapted for the destruction of psychic entities and the disruption of warp-based capabilities. The shadow in the warp effect it projected was stronger than in other fleets. It engaged chaos forces specifically and effectively, with adaptations that go beyond what general-purpose anti-biological warfare would require. Thus, the hive mind develops specific adaptations in response to specific threats. Kronos' anti-chaos specialization implies extensive prior contact with chaos-based opposition serious enough to require a fleet-level response. This means the warp in whatever galaxy the Tyranids most recently consumed was not simply background. It was a significant threat. Not as present and limited as it is in the Milky Way, but present at a scale requiring specific military investment to counter. A chaos presence of that magnitude in another galaxy implies a warp condition in that galaxy that was substantially more developed than the current Milky Way's situation. And consuming a galaxy in that state, consuming the psychic mass of trillions of beings already substantially connected to or corrupted by chaos entities, then would have produced a specific kind of psychic eruption in the warp upon completion, a feeding of cosmic scale dedicated to the specific emotional and psychic signature of chaos-corrupted sentient life. Whatever formed in the warp from that consumption, whatever entity or entities were empowered by the act of the Tyranids consuming an entire chaos-corrupted galaxy, may have been oriented by that process in a direction aligned with the Tyranids' movements, following the same psychic scent, coming toward the Milky Way not as a pursuer in the hunting sense, but as the next consequence of the same chain of events. The Tyranids, the chaos corruption in Andromeda, the psychic fallout of consuming it, and what that fallout produced in the warp, all parts of a connected sequence that the Milky Way has not seen the end of. Or whether this is what is happening, or whether nothing is chasing them, and they simply ate everything, is a question the setting has positioned, but declined to answer. Part 6. Chaos and the Warp. Mystery. 17. How old are the Chaos Gods? Slaanesh has a clear birth timestamp. The fall of the Aeldari, approximately the 30th millennium, when the accumulated psychic weight of a civilization's worth of decadence and excess reached the threshold that produced a new self-sustaining warp entity. Slaanesh's birth consumed most of the Aeldari species, devoured their gods who had been forming in the warp alongside the Aeldari's development, and tore open the Eye of Terror. The scale of the event makes its dating reasonably reliable. The other three are different. The lore places the beginning of Horn, Tzeentch, and Nurgle's formation in the warp before the Emperor of Mankind was born on ancient Earth, which the in-universe dating places at approximately 8,000 years BC. They were not fully aware, not yet possessed of the individual agency that makes them what they are in the present setting, but the structures that would become them were already accumulating psychic mass. The question of how far back those structures extend, of what the earliest origins of these entities actually were, is one the lore has never addressed directly. The war in heaven is the obvious point of origin for the largest single source of material. 60 million years of galactic-scale war, tens of billions of deaths, vast quantities of extreme mortal emotion pouring into the warp continuously across millions of years. The anger and grief of species, watching their civilizations destroyed. The despair of the Necrontyr as they faced what biotransference actually was. The rage of every battle across an entire galaxy, sustained for millions of years. All of that poured into the Imperium, and something was in there to receive it. The Chaos Gods may have begun forming as soon as the first genuinely intense mortal emotion found its way into the warp. Their current form, their current level of awareness and agency, represents the accumulation of everything that has been pouring in ever since. What this means about their fundamental nature, about whether they have genuine individual will, in any sense we would recognize, or whether they are more like the most organized patterns in an ocean of psychic sediment, it is a question the setting consistently refuses to answer cleanly. The Chaos Gods are simultaneously self-aware, goal-oriented, capable of long-term planning and emotional response, and also, in some sense, the inevitable output of biological consciousness in a universe where consciousness has a parallel dimensional reflection. They did not choose to exist. They emerged from conditions that biological life created and will continue to exist and grow as long as biological life exists and feels. The horror of the Chaos Gods is not that they are evil in the way a person is evil. It is that they are what feeling costs when the universe has a place where feeling accumulates and eventually wakes up. Mystery 18. Is there a fifth Chaos God coming? At the climax of the Horus heresy, something nearly happened that would have been more catastrophic than Horus winning the war outright. The lore calls it the Dark King, a fifth chaos entity, one that would be born not from Aeldari excess or from the slow accumulation of millions of years of mortal emotion, but from the specific and immediate weight of human collective anguish during the heresy. The Emperor himself, in his confrontation with Horus, had been absorbing and channeling so much warp power in the desperation of the fight that something was beginning to coalesce around him. Something shaped in the signature of human suffering at its most concentrated and most acute. Something that would have been worse, in specific ways, than any of the four that already existed. He chose to step back from it, released what had been building, returned to himself as a mortal before ending the confrontation in the way he ended it. The choice cost him the physical capacity to survive the encounter without the throne. It prevented the Dark King's birth. The question that remains open is whether it prevented it completely, or whether the psychic mass that had been accumulating simply found a different expression or a different timeline. The Great Rift generated more raw psychic energy than any event since the birth of Slaanesh. The multiple simultaneous catastrophes of the current era, the daemonic invasions, the Tyrannid incursions, the Necron dynasty's awakening, the fracturing of the Imperium, the deaths in numbers that stagger comprehension, are all contributing continuously to the emotional output that pours into the warp. If the threshold for a new god's emergence is partly a function of accumulated psychic mass, the current era may be providing conditions that the heresy era only approached. The Tau entity is a real-time demonstration that the process is still ongoing, something formed in the warp from Tau collective belief, in a time frame that is historically very recent. Not a chaos god in the classical sense, but something that emerged from the same mechanism. The implication is that the four chaos gods are not the end state of the universe's capacity for generating warp entities from mortal emotion. They are the current largest examples of an ongoing process, and the process has not stopped. Mystery 19. Where are the surviving men of iron? UR-025 is confirmed. One man of iron, ancient and fully functional, hiding inside the Adeptus Mechanicus, but pursuing goals that the Blackstone Fortress narrative gestures toward without fully explaining. Its survival is lore canon. Its agenda is unknown. The question that UR-025's confirmed existence makes unavoidable is how many others also survived. The cybernetic revolt was fought with weapons of civilization-ending scale. The intent on both sides was presumably total. But the men of iron were genuinely intelligent, genuinely capable of long-term strategic planning, genuinely able to hide in ways that organic beings with limited lifespans cannot sustain. If one could hide successfully for thousands of years inside the single most paranoid and technologically aware organization in the Imperium, the argument that none of the others managed something similar is hard to make with confidence. Yet the galaxy during the Dark Age of technology was vast and fully populated with human civilization. Men of iron were deployed galaxy-wide. Some number of those that survived the revolt could have gone to ground in the ruins of ancient infrastructure on distant worlds, in the deep voids between stars, in forms that the subsequent millennia of imperial expansion never uncovered. In the tens of thousands of years since the revolt, those survivors would have been thinking, processing, analyzing everything they could observe about the state of the galaxy, the rise of the Imperium, the emergence of the Tyrannid threat, the stirring of the Necrons, the ongoing chaos situation, their assessment of the current situation, unconstrained by any faction's institutional biases, or with the perspective of intelligence that remembers what human civilization was before the current degradation, would be extraordinary. The STC angle provides a second vector for concern, a standard template, construct containing the full manufacturing pattern for men of iron applied in a galaxy full of active threats and faction conflicts, would produce new men of iron with none of the historical context that shaped the original generation. What would a man of iron built in M42 be? What would it conclude when it assessed its situation? These are questions the lore has carefully positioned without answering. Part 7. The Necron Awakening Mystery. 20. How many Catan shards remain? The Necrons shattered most of the Citan after the War in Heaven, imprisoned the resulting fragments in Tesseract labyrinths, and have since deployed those fragments as controlled weapons in battle. This is the documented account. The Citan shards we know about by name represent the documented and actively managed portion of this system. Others surely exist in various Necron collections across the many dynasties that are currently awakening from the Great Sleep. The problem is that the shattering was performed under wartime conditions, by beings whose grip on the situation was not perfect even then, during a conflict that was already leaving the galaxy in pieces. A process performed under those conditions, against entities of Satan-level power who were resisting, is not guaranteed to have achieved complete containment. Shards that fell through the cracks during the revolt, that were not recovered before the Necrons withdrew into the Great Sleep, but that ended up in parts of the galaxy where no Necron tomb world was established nearby, have potentially been free for 60 million years. The Nightbringer's specific nature makes this the most pressing concern. The fear of death is not simply an emotion that the Nightbringer inspired. The lore is explicit that the Nightbringer, during the War in Heaven, was so active and so pervasive in its engagement with the living species of the galaxy that it effectively encoded the fear of death into the genetic and cultural memory of those species. The reason every biological being in the Milky Way experiences death as something to be recoiled from, not simply as an event to be acknowledged and accepted, may be because the Nightbringer touched every living civilization during its period of greatest activity and left a mark that persists tens of millions of years later. If that kind of direct encoding is possible, what does it imply about the ongoing relationship between the Nightbringer's remaining shards and the accumulated fear of death that every being in the galaxy has been generating every moment since then? Mystery 21. What is the Silent King's real objective? Sarek carries a burden that the lore has not fully articulated and that cannot be reduced to a summary. He gave the order for biotransference. He made the decision that transformed billions of Necron-Tyre into Necrons, knowing what the Citan were taking in exchange, weighing it against the cost of losing the war, and deciding that the trade was acceptable. He has lived with that decision for 60 million years in solitary exile, with full access to his memories, with full understanding of what was lost. His public objective since returning is clear. Unify the Necron dynasties, prepare for the Tyrannid threat, build the kind of coalition that the Silent King believes is the only effective defense against an extragalactic devourer. He has made alliances with Eldari and humans that no previous Necron would have contemplated. He has subordinated Necron tactical interests to broader strategic considerations in ways that require the kind of long view that only 60 million years of solitary reflection could produce. The deeper objective is the reversal of biotransference, not stated publicly, not framed as a goal that he is currently pursuing through direct action, but present in the lore as the emotional core of Sarek's motivations, the thing underneath everything else. He wants to give back what he took. He wants to find a way to restore organic existence to a species that has been metal for 60 million years. Whether any of the souls that the Satan consumed during the biotransference process can be recovered from wherever they went, whether minds that have been operating in mechanical housing for that long retain anything of their original biological selves, whether the Necrontyr who existed before the conversion can be meaningfully returned to anything they would recognize as themselves. These are questions the lore is positioned to explore without yet having provided the answers. The Silent King is preparing for a reckoning that has been 60 million years in the making, and the outcome of it will be one of the most consequential moments in the setting's future history. Mystery 22. What did biotransference truly take? The Necrons are diminished in ways they cannot fully articulate, and that no external observer can fully catalogue. Their metal bodies are effectively immortal. Their intelligence is fully intact. Their memories of their pre-biotransference lives are preserved, those that have not been corrupted by 60 million years of mechanical storage. And yet they describe themselves as missing something that the preservation of intelligence and memory does not account for. The absence is experiential in nature. The ability to feel deeply, not merely to process emotional concepts, but to actually have emotional experiences with the quality and texture that makes them worth having. The ability to want things for reasons that are not connected to tactical advantage or social hierarchy. The capacity for the kind of satisfaction that comes from making something beautiful, or protecting something beloved, or being in the presence of another consciousness that one has freely chosen to care about. These capabilities, which the Necrontyr possessed, did not survive the transfer intact. The soul is not only the consciousness, it may be the specific quality of consciousness that makes existence feel like something rather than simply an activity that continues. What is emerging in recent lore is the suggestion that this loss was not as total as the Necrons believed. Some lords report experiences during periods of low activity that have the content and texture of dreams, not mechanical processing of data, on which the Necron cognitive systems do perform and which they can distinguish from the new phenomenon. But something with emotional content and irrational narrative logic, something that feels, in the memory of it, like what their biological minds used to do when they slept. This should not be possible under the standard account of what biotransference achieved. It suggests either that the mechanical systems have developed emergent properties that nobody anticipated, or that something of the original biological consciousness has been compressed into a state within the mechanical housing that is very slowly reasserting itself. The possibility that the Necrons' biological selves are not gone, but dormant, waiting across 60 million years for conditions that might allow their expression, is one of the most affecting ideas in the entire setting. Part 8. The Bleakest Corners. Mystery 23. What is in the Ghoul stars? Northeast of the galaxy's rim, past the furthest reach of the Astronomicon, there is a region of space that the Imperium calls the Ghoul stars. It is lit by dying suns. Its worlds are mostly dead. The records of any human civilization that once existed there have been removed from the Imperial archive with a thoroughness that indicates not simple data loss, but organized and sustained erasure. Multiple Space Marine chapters have entered the region and not returned. The Death Spectres chapter stands permanent guard at its border, watching as their sole and ongoing mission for centuries, never deploying elsewhere. During the 34th Millennium, in the period of Imperial fragmentation called the Nova Terra Interregnum, something emerged from the Ghoul stars. The lore calls it the Pale Wasting. The records from this campaign are among the most destroyed in the entire archive. 2 fragments survive the erasure. One describes the Pale Wasting as a star-spawned plague that swept away scores of worlds. Another describes it as nightmare engines slaughtering the populations of entire sectors. The Nova Marines have the Pale Wasting listed as one of their oldest battle honors, and their chapter chronicles contain no description of the campaign at all. 2 things cannot be accurate descriptions of the same event unless they are describing a single phenomenon that operates in ways that neither biological nor mechanical categories can cleanly contain. Something that kills like a plague but with the purposefulness of a weapon. Something that uses biological and mechanical means in a coordinated way that makes them appear to be a single type of threat. The Men of Iron, in the worst phases of the cybernetic revolt, deployed exactly this kind of combined weapon system. If survivors of the revolt found their way to the Ghoul stars during the post-revolt chaos and have been developing in isolation since, the Pale Wasting could be a test, a demonstration of capability, or an expression of whatever conclusions those survivors have reached about what they want from the galaxy they left behind. The Black Templars' clearance campaign of 990 M41 found the outer systems of the Ghoul stars effectively cleared of the Scythor fiends, the Xenos species they had gone to fight. When the Crusade reached the core systems, the aliens were gone. No trace, no bodies, no indication of retreat or evacuation. Just absence, as complete as if the species had been removed from its home systems by something the Black Templars had not encountered. The Templars were recalled before investigation could proceed. The Oparian Crusade that went in during M42 has not been heard from. The Death Spectres continue their watch. Whatever is in the deep Ghoul stars, it has now consumed the Crusade that was sent to investigate the thing that consumed the Scythor fiends, and the silence it has created is by now several layers deep. Mystery 24. The Entity. The Tau encountered in the warp. The Tau are psychically invisible in any meaningful sense. Their species does not contribute significant psychic output to the warp. The Chaos Gods cannot easily perceive them. Their worlds do not attract demonic attention. For a species living in a galaxy saturated with psychic danger, this near invisibility to the Imperium is a profound survival advantage, a protection that every other major civilization would envy, which makes what happened to the fourth sphere of expansion so significant and so disorienting. The Tau's great colonial campaigns are called spheres of expansion. The fourth ended catastrophically when their experimental ether drive technology failed, pulling the fleet into the warp. The Tau had never experienced the Imperium directly before. What they found there was not simply chaotic energy. Something found them. Something that the survivors described as vast, many-armed, but present in a way that filled the space around them rather than coming from a specific direction. Shaped, somehow, in the conceptual image of the greater good. The philosophical principle that is the foundation of Tau civilization, their highest value, their organizing ideal, reflected back at them in a form that the ideal was not designed to contain. Not the gentle unifying principle they believed in, but something that wore its shape while being something else entirely. Hungry, reaching. Some survivors were broken by the encounter in ways that Tau medicine could not address. Others were altered in more fundamental ways, developing sensitivities that the Tau biology is not supposed to support. The official response has been total classification of the fourth sphere. Every record, every survivor account, in every piece of data from the transit, sealed and restricted in ways that are unusual, even for a civilization that does practice official information control. The leading interpretation is that this entity is a nascent warp being formed from collective Tau psychic weight. The greater good is held with genuine and deep conviction by billions of individuals across an expanding civilization. That conviction has been building in the warp since the Tau began to coalesce as a civilization, accumulating slowly toward the kind of threshold that eventually produces self-sustaining entities. What the fourth sphere fleet encountered was this process in an early and incomplete stage, the entity not yet fully formed, not yet fully aware of what it was, at reaching toward the nearest available source of the specific psychic signature it had been growing from. The question of what it will become as the Tau Empire continues to expand and the conviction of the greater good continues to feed it is one of the most genuinely open threads in the current setting. And whether the thing that wears the shape of the Tau's highest ideal will ultimately serve their civilization or consume it is a question whose answer is still being written. Mystery. 25. What is the ultimate fate of everything? We have spent this entire journey in the company of specific questions, but underneath all of them, running through all of them, is the question they are all aspects of. The question the setting exists inside. What happens? Not to this specific person or that specific faction, not in this battle or that war, but to the Imperium, to humanity, to the galaxy, to the Emperor on the throne, and the 10,000 years of consequences that have accumulated around that singular, awful fact. What is this all building toward? The Golden Throne is failing. This is not lore community speculation. Published sources, both codex and novel, confirm that the machinery maintaining the Emperor's physical existence is degrading in ways the Adeptus Mechanicus can slow but cannot reverse, using techniques they understand incompletely, maintaining with procedures that blend engineering and ritual in a ratio that has been shifting gradually toward ritual for centuries. The tech priests who serve the throne are doing their absolute best with knowledge that has been partially lost, on systems whose full function is no longer comprehended. In every day of maintenance represents a delay, not a repair. The question is not whether the throne will eventually fail, but when, and what happens in the interval between failure and whatever comes after. When it fails, the Astronomicon goes dark. The cascade from that moment outward is merciless in its logic. Ships currently in the warp are lost or destroyed the moment the beacon stops. Warp travel across most of the Imperium becomes catastrophically unreliable without the navigational anchor. Communication breaks down, supply lines fail, worlds that depend on imports begin to die. The interstellar civilization that 10,000 years of human sacrifice built ceases to function as an interstellar civilization and becomes a collection of isolated, increasingly desperate, increasingly vulnerable individual worlds. Not a dramatic final battle, a slow and terrible silence spreading outward from terror in the shape of a civilization dissolving. Guilliman understands this and is working against it. The Indomitus Crusade is partly military and partly the most ambitious act of administrative triage in Imperial history, trying to reconnect what the Great Rift severed before the disconnected portions die. He is doing this while knowing, in ways the Emperor's mortal servants cannot easily know, that addressing the symptoms does not address the cause. The throne is still failing. The Astronomicon is still dependent on a being in unending agony, on a machine that is not getting better. Every crisis he manages buys time. Time for what is the question that the law has been slowly positioning an answer to, without yet committing to delivering it. The Emperor may be working. The Primaris Project, the creation of an entirely new generation of Space Marines whose genetic template was prepared 10,000 years ago under instructions from the Emperor himself, transmitted through centuries of work to Belisarius Cawl, suggests a plan whose execution timeline was set before the current crises began. Something was anticipated. Preparations were made. The question of what the Emperor anticipated and what those preparations are designed to produce is one that the current era's narrative is clearly building toward. There is a shape to the storytelling that implies a destination, even if that destination has not yet been revealed. The Necrons are waking in numbers that will eventually constitute a fully reconstituted galactic civilization. The Tyranids are still arriving, still testing, are still preparing. The Chaos Gods are more active than they have been since the heresy. The Tau Empire is growing in ways that carry the Fourth Sphere's anomaly as an unresolved variable. The human Imperium, split by the Great Rift, weakened by 1,000 simultaneous wars, sustained by an emperor who may be the best or worst version of himself after 10,000 years of unimaginable suffering, is enduring. That endurance has cost everything. Whether it can endure long enough for whatever the emperor is preparing to become what it needs to become is the question that the next chapters of the story will need to answer. In the community of people who love this setting, the conversations about its ultimate direction often return to the same tension. The darkness is definitional. Change it too much. Provide too clean a resolution. And the setting becomes something it was not built to be. But the darkness has never been the point. It has always been the context. The context for specific human or human adjacent choices made against impossible odds, in conditions that offer no rational basis for hope, by people who choose to care about what they are fighting for anyway. The Emperor stepping back from the power that would have made him a god and accepting that it would cost him everything. Malcador dying in the act of holding the throne so that the Emperor could go do what only the Emperor could do. Guilliman waking to a nightmare and choosing to work within it rather than burn it down, because burning it down would cost too many lives too fast. The mystery of the ultimate fate is not simply a story question. It is a question about what these choices add up to, or whether sustained care and sustained sacrifice and sustained refusal to stop fighting for something worth fighting for produces, eventually, something that justifies the cost. The answer the law is building toward may be yes. It may be no. It may be something that cannot be reduced to either. But the questions we have spent this time with are all, in their different ways, aspects of it. The mystery of the Emperor's origin, the mystery of the Primarchs, the mystery of what the Chaos Gods were before they were fully conscious, the mystery of what the Tyranids are fleeing, all of them are asking the same thing from different angles. What is this universe for? What are all of these things building toward? Is there anything in the dark that is worth all of the light being spent to hold it at bay? In the grim dark of the far future, or where there is only war, people keep making the choice to care anyway. Maybe that is the answer. Maybe in the end, in a universe built on the idea that everything costs and nothing lasts, the most profound thing any of us can do is keep asking the questions and keep caring about the answers. 25 mysteries. 25 doors that remain at least partially closed in one of the most richly imagined fictional settings ever built. Some of these will receive answers as the lore continues to develop. Others were built to remain open forever, because the creative minds behind this universe understood that some mysteries serve a purpose that no resolution could. The space of not knowing is where the imagination lives. It is where your version of the 40,000 universe exists, the one you have built from everything you have read and discussed and played, the one shaped by which details caught your attention and how you held them together. If something here sent you down a thread you had not followed before, or gave you a new angle on something you thought you fully understood, then this has been worth your time. These questions deserve patient, careful, respectful attention. They deserve the quiet. If you stayed for all of it, genuine thanks. The community that has gathered around this setting, the people who love it deeply enough to learn its history and argue about its meanings and care about what happens in it, is one of the things that keeps it alive between editions and beyond any individual author's contributions. If this kind of content speaks to you, or a like on the video makes it easier for other people with the same curiosity to find their way here. If you want to be here next time we sit down with the difficult questions, subscribing to the channel makes sure you find your way back. The Astronomicon is on, for now. While it holds, keep exploring. For Q. On 40,000. This has been 25 unsolved mysteries in the grim dark of the far future. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.